One knee shifted uncomfortably on his horse's back. He looked at the shaman as gray eyes black surged beside his own mount. He had not foreseen that by giving up his legging to cover Crooked Eye's wounds, he would gain a few of his own. Now that the excitement of the battle on the hill and the rescue no longer blocked it, the pain on the underside of his left leg was screaming. One knee had lost some skin to the rocks and dirt of the hillside he had slid down, and the way they were driving their horses was just adding emphasis to his misery. Instead of gritting his teeth in defiance of the pain, One Knee acknowledged and accepted it. He had always found that giving suffering its due somehow made it more bearable. He kept his breathing easy and let his mind distract him. The decision to head east instead of back the way they had come was a natural one. There were still at least 10 armed men in the canyon. Looping back past the mouth of the canyon for the familiarity of a trail once ridden was a fool's move. Their number had been cut to less than 5 men. The shaman could barely keep his mount and would be a detriment in a fight. One Knee looked at Crooked Eye again and watched him clutching desperately at his mount's mane. What was it all about? What had the shaman gone through besides kidnapping and torture, and why? One Knee's band was now heading south around the backside of the canyon, still riding hard. Their way was an easy one until a thicket of pine trees forced a decision upon them. Should they continue heading south for the cover of the trees and slow their pace, or should they go back toward the west, riding harder but closer to their foes? One Knee did not have much time to make his choice. He reasoned that the enemy did not know their number, who they were, or which direction they would be heading. They wouldn't be ready for a chase, and might not even have fresh mounts. The leader kicked his horse and headed toward the glaring sun. Of course, he did not understand the mind of the renegade. He did not know that their loyalties had dissolved into themselves, and that they did not have the strong ties that would drive a chase for revenge. Most had broken all such ties and allegiances long ago, and were loyal to their own survival and nothing else. They only banded together because of the herd law, where greater numbers meant a greater chance to keep living. The other outlaws viewed the killing of their fellows as their bad luck, and a few of them had even gotten pleasure out of seeing the feared Sharp Elbow stuck with arrows like porcupine quills. So the fear the men felt in their flight was somewhat unwarranted. And when they saw 3 men who were heading their way turn their horses and run from them, they still did not realize it. They wrongly assumed the 3 outlaws were riding back to get the others. One Knee waved a hand and pushed his horse in a more southerly direction, away from the 3 riders. In his mind, the riders were not close enough to chase down and slaughter before they made it to the other renegades, and brought reinforcements, not without risking being seen by those reinforcements. The men rode hard until night fell. They knew they had been successful so far, but real success was completed only with a safe return home. They slowed their horses in the dark, but kept moving. When men and beasts could take no more, they sheltered for the night in a hollow that was ringed heavily by trees. The ground was dry and hard, but after giving the water in their skins to their exhausted mounts, many of them slept on that hard ground like they were in a woman's arms. Crooked Eye floated in a strange and deep sleep that was filled with hideous dreams. He tried to wake himself a few times, but his body needed the sleep too much to give it up. One Knee had inspected the raw flesh of his left leg, twisting his head behind him. What he could see by the light of the new moon did not please him. He stole a little water from his horse and made a mud paste to cool the wound. Then he slept as soundly as the rest. Walks in Blood had drifted off more slowly than the others. His mind ran with questions, even while his body became so still he thought he would never move again. His legs jerked and twitched as they unknit, and soon his mind unwound as well. The men slept soundly, but not long. They were still men who were far afield, men who had killed and knew instinctively that killing always sought to be answered, usually by more death. They rose before first light, and all were starving. They ate the rest of the meat from their packs, and the dryness of the meal reminded them that they had no water. Smokesteep brought out his war pipe, and they did in what was left of his tobacco. The men had not wasted their energy on words during the flight of the night before. Neither had they said much before falling to sleep. Now they looked deep into one another's eyes, sharing something unspoken yet profound. Smokesteep spoke quietly. To the fallen one, may his journey over the southern rivers bring him peace. He drew deeply on his pipe and handed it to One Knee. He and the rest smoked silently and thought of Gray Eyes, who had finally gotten the gun he so wanted. After a time, One Knee said, I think we should press on and trust that we will happen upon water. We should avoid our lodge site, even though we know fresh water stands close to it. Our enemy is bound to know the land better than we do. They will know of the stream and see the cut trees. But we should try the gorge. The gorge is the quickest way back. If we go around it into land strange to us, we may stumble upon worse foes than the renegades. And once we hit the gorge, we can push our horses. That is, if we can find water on the way to it. No one disputed One Knee's words. He had proven himself to be a good leader, despite Gray Eye's death, which was attributed by all to the man's own carelessness. One Knee had handled the terror of Singsloud and led a successful raid. They trusted him. And that trust paid off. Water was indeed found, though not the sweetest tasting drink. Still, the men partook of the backwater rather than tracing it to what perhaps would be a cleaner source. All wanted to hit the gorge running and get home, so they sucked on stones and ate grasses to get the taste out of their mouths, and kept riding. As they angled west, the land was sometimes difficult to negotiate. This was not the sparse ground that had caused them to lose Crooked Eye's trail on the first day of their journey. They had to slow their pace to allow the horses to pick their way through thorny bushes and heavy brush that could hide leg-breaking holes or poisonous snakes. But soon the land became familiar to them, and they made a beeline for the entrance of the gorge. They stormed through it like the whole Crow Nation was thundering at their heels. They had nearly completed a daring and successful mission, and they felt the fear of the man climbing the cliff. They didn't want to almost make it and fall. But they came to a sudden halt just as they were leaving the gorge. They all dismounted and formed a circle. It was Rides Low. The man lay on his back. 2 holes, each big enough to put 2 fingers in, were in his midsection. He had been stripped and scalped. A flap of skin stuck out from his bloody head that told of the scalper's dull knife. Rides Low's eyes were staring at nothing, wide with surprise. But as bad as it was to see a fellow tribesman and companion in such a way, an object beside the body brought them much more fear. It was a narrow wooden pole that was driven into the ground between Rides Low's naked legs. The end of the pole was rounded, and on that end, painted in red, was the head of the serpent, the sign of the snake people, the Shoshone, the deadliest of their enemies. One knee looked around the body, then quickly stopped and mounted his horse. He had seen that the Shoshone were more than their few, and that their tracks headed north, and that was all he needed to see. The others followed him away from Rides Low and the awful token. Why the Snake war party was so far out of their territory, none could figure. They were a southwestern tribe that lived close to the great mountains. The riders did not puzzle too hard, though. All had known someone before Rides Low that had been killed by snakes, and some had had the misfortune of seeing the snakes bring that death. They rode the rest of the way back as quickly as possible. All felt joyous relief when they hit the stream where Crooked Eye had been taken. It was all the medicine man could do to control himself, filled as he was with emotion. He had spent the journey home in agony and fatigue, filled with hunger, despite the scraps Walks in Blood and the others had spared him. As the men trotted home in rapturous victory, Crooked Eye realized that 2 men had given their lives to save his. He felt sublime gratitude and the feeling of being lucky to survive himself. He felt many things, most of which were good. But later, much later, he would suffer from the knowledge of their deaths. Gopher Boy spat in the Shoshone's face. The man wiped his cheek calmly and drew his knife. He poked the crow with it, just enough to make him bleed, just enough to let him know that such behavior would only make things worse. Then he went back to smearing his victim with the honeycomb. The Shoshone war party had caught Gopher Boy riding his piebald hard to the south. Turning his horse away from them slowed the crow, making him easy to catch. The Shoshone with the honeycomb had knocked Gopher Boy off his mount with a sweep of his war club. The captive renegade woke to find himself bound and tied to his own horse, and he knew that his life was over. It was the same war party that had used Rides Low for target practice as they stood atop the gorge. They had also killed a few of the fleeing renegades, and were sorely disappointed at the inferior quality of the horseflesh the outlaws rode. And so Gopher Boy was about to pay for their frustration, even though the piebald he rode was a fine mount. There would be a dispute later over who should claim the horse, the man who struck the horse's rider, or the one who ran the horse down and retrieved it. Such disputes could turn deadly if the parties involved refused to give up their arguments. Gopher Boy gasped for breath and struggled hopelessly against the cords on his hands and feet. He watched another one of the Shoshone sink a snake paw beside him, and he swallowed hard. The crow had learned at least one thing from the renegade chief he had killed, so he spoke as calmly as he could to all the Shoshone within earshot. Killing a shaman in such a way is not wise. You will anger the unseen ones whom I have served my entire life. The Shoshone with the honeycomb sucked out some of its sweetness before discarding it. He looked at the pitiful crow and said, "Do not waste your time on such words. You are just a dying man. If you had any power to use against us, what are you doing staked to the ground?" "Look at this." The voice came from behind the speaker and made him whirl around. He walked over to one of his companions, who had taken something wrapped in red cloth from the pouch on the side of the crow's horse. The excited man holding the red parcel drew all the snake's attention. "Don't touch that! Leave it alone!" Gopher Boy yelled. The man's captors just looked at him. They had heard tortured men scream nonsense before. The one who had smeared the crow with honey studied the doomed man. The ants were already swarming him. drawn by the sweetness he wore and made active by the heat. He took the object from his companion. Gopher Boy laughed maniacally, not yet hysterical from the biting insects. But the ants had not yet reached his privates, where the snake had smeared honey with exquisite care. The honeycomb man peeled back the cloth and gasped. He looked at the doomed crow, who began to laugh his mad laugh again. He felt suddenly uneasy, so he walked over to his victim and kicked him in the ribs, smearing his moccasin with blood. "What is the meaning of this, dead man?" "What it means is I will be revenged upon you, you fool. The power of the white hand will live after I die, and the same power that has struck me down will do you in as well." Gopher Boy controlled himself, not letting the panic he felt sweep over him yet. Not yet. "You have just made the same mistake I made. You touched the death hand." The Shoshone looked at the pale limb he held doubtfully. "If this is a death hand, as you say it is, why would you carry it with you?" "I am a young shaman. I did not understand the power of the thing, but I do now. All who touch the white hand die, just as in life all whom the white hand touched also died. Do you not know whose hand it is you hold?" Now the Shoshone all looked at each other. White Hand was known to them. They had feared him for many, many summers. The man had been a bringer of death among their people for as long as most could remember. The honeycomb man wanted to throw the hand away from him, but he continued to hold it because he did not wish to appear weak. "You killed White Hand, then?" one of the snakes asked. Gopher Boy laughed his laugh, but it was no longer full of fake mania. The ants had reached his privates. "Me? Kill White Hand? An evil spirit killed White Hand, and that spirit resides in his hand." The fearful man holding the hand lost control. He sought to quiet the mouth of the crow before it dripped with any more curses. He leaped forward and grabbed the snake pole, pulling it from the ground. He drove the snake with all his might straight through Gopher Boy's midsection. The crow writhed for an instant and was still. He never uttered a sound as he died. The killer of the young crow pulled a piece of rawhide from his leggings. With it, he tied the cursed hand to the top of the snake pole, the withered fingers pointing skyward. When the war party had gathered and was ready to leave, the Shoshone all stared at the bizarre sight of the pale hand on the wooden arm that grew from the dead man's stomach. The one that had held the honeycomb jerked the piebald's reins away from another snake, and the man glared at him. Not everyone was happy to see the return of One Knee's war party. Tens to Jump watched the 6 men riding into camp whooping and yelling triumphantly, and he felt disappointment. He looked at Crooked Eye as he sat on the big black horse, and he was shocked to see that the man still lived. The shaman looked worse for the journey and had obviously been wounded, but there he was. Tens to Jump watched Snowbird run up to her man and joyfully help him off his mount. The chief had visited Snowbird a couple of times every day after the war party was gone, under the guise of concern. He really just wanted to be near her and feel the strong desire he felt in her presence. Then he would go back to his lodge and take out his lust on his wives. Now he thought he should have taken Snowbird by force, but he was not an evil man. If he was, he would have dragged his feet picking a rescue party and chosen less capable men. Then he would have slowly worked his way into Snowbird's good graces and taken her to wife. Eben knew he wanted her, and it would have been so easy for him to use his influence to get her. Tends to Jump shrugged and walked up with the rest of the people. One Knee kept himself aloof from the celebration, greeting his wives and patting the heads of his children. Then he looked for the new widows. He saw a gray-eyed woman and walked toward her. The leader of the war party knew he wouldn't have to tell her that her husband was dead. The man's absence said it loud and clear. But maybe she needed to hear it, or want to know how it happened. Niels and Kill's jaw was set and her eye grim when he approached her, but she accepted his hand on her shoulder. He died well, a brave man killed in battle, helping us to survive. It was an outlaw that shot him. His end was quick. She nodded numbly, then turned and walked slowly away with her head down. Niels and Kills would grieve later. Now she wanted to see her children and be with them. One Knee turned and saw that Rideslow's widow was watching him. The timid woman did not wait to hear the words. She ran away from him, wailing in bitter tones. One Knee turned back to the men of his party, breathing deeply. "You need to see Herb Woman right away," Snowbird said. She wanted to squeeze the breath out of Crooked Eye, but saw that his chest was in bad shape. She walked him along with an arm around his shoulder. Crooked Eye laughed. "You see, I married you because you are so practical." He slid his hand down her and squeezed her backside. "And you thought I married you because of this." Walks in Blood had never been received in such a way, and found all the backslapping and excited interest a little intoxicating. He spotted his father, Blue Horse, and saw that even now the man could scarcely crack a smile his way. Walks in Blood shrugged, and began to lead his pony to where the people picketed their horses, but then Brightwater nearly knocked him off his feet. She actually picked him up in her arms like a child, hugging him and swinging him around. Walks in Blood heard people laughing at the two of them and forced his way back to the ground self-consciously. He looked at Brightwater's face, breaking into a good-natured smile himself. He conceded that the sight of a successful warrior being manhandled by a girl a head shorter must have been a comical sight. "Where were you? What are you, crazy? Joining a war party? What's wrong with you? You should have told me." Walks in Blood felt deep happiness. It was good that nothing had changed. It was good that she could still yell at him and make him feel wanted at the same time. It seemed to him that he had been gone a long time, and somehow he expected that things might be different. But here he was, and here she was. "Walks in Blood, show us what you have taken from the renegades." The voice belonged to Smoke Steep. He had just finished showing the excited crowd around him Sharp Elbow's gun, saying, "This was Sharp Elbow's weapon, but he does not need it any more." Then he took out the feared outlaw's scalp, and most of the people had cheered. Apparently Sharp Elbow had not been a popular member of their community when he lived with them. Walks in Blood walked over to Smoke Steep, dragging his feet a little. He looked at Smoke Steep and Leaping Calf holding the guns they had taken. He knew that taking an enemy's gun was the greatest of war coups. He felt everyone's eyes on him as he walked his horse back toward the crowd. He picked up his pace, determined to get it over with. The night they had sheltered in the hollow with the trees, he had taken Sharp Elbow's knife out of his right legging and put it in the folding pouch on the side of his pony. The blade of the knife had covered nearly the whole side of his thigh, and the point of it had poked a hole in the knee of his legging as he rode. In the single-mindedness of their journey home, he had never shown the knife to anybody, and he didn't want to now, but he reached into the pouch on his pony's side anyway. All I got was this, Walks in Blood said sheepishly. When he pulled out the bare knife, everyone gasped. Amid all the fuss being made over the treasured knife, Smokesteep was kicking himself from the inside. He recognized the bone handle, seeing a mind picture of it sticking out from underneath Sharp Elbow. At least the boy didn't tell people he got the blade from Sharp Elbow and make me look like a fool, Smokesteep thought, and he felt kind feelings towards Walks in Blood, thinking him tactful. Walks in Blood swung his wide eyes back and forth amidst the clamoring crowd. They stopped when they met Brightwater's, and he returned her smile and shrugged. Then he raised the bare knife high in the air and whooped loudly as the edge of the blade gleamed in the sun. That stuff stinks. What is it? The old woman will not tell me, and I don't blame her. A smart person does not give away trade secrets. Crooked Eye wiped the tears off his face and looked at the pink swelling on his chest. He had spent the first 3 days since returning from being held captive sleeping and shaking with fever. He had stayed in his lodge, taking a little food, mostly blood soup, and resting. After the fever had passed and his appetite came back, all that was left was the pain. The horizontal tears left by the sun torture had turned into tender mounds that leaked poison. And every morning he went to Herb Woman's lodge to have that poison cleaned out. First, she would soak his wounds in some foul-smelling potion of medicine plants and warm water. Then she would open the wounds, cleaning out scabby tissue and white poison with all the tenderness of someone fleshing a hide. It did not help Crooked Eye get to sleep at night knowing that he would be tortured so when he woke, but the wounds were deep and the awful process needed done. Crooked Eye watched the tracks of his chest drip blood. It was a good sign. "Hold still now," Snowbird said. She tenderly wiped the blood away with a trade cloth. Her mind had been so full of questions during the days since Crooked Eye's return that she found it difficult not to spill them on her husband. But she knew the man would talk when he was ready and needed to focus on gaining his strength and getting well, so she held herself back. "I still think the wound should have been sewn shut. How are you supposed to get better if you lose half your blood each morning?" "The old woman says the wounds should remain open until they close themselves. She is the best healer we have." Crooked Eye looked carefully at the woman blotting his chest. "Did I say anything while in the fever's grip?" "No. You mostly just shook with sweat. Why? Are you afraid that you let some trade secret slip out?" Crooked Eye sighed deeply. "I must be getting well since you have decided to start harassing me again." He stayed quiet for a few moments and watched the sunlight stream in through the top of his lodge. Being taken like that, I just wondered if I said anything. He knew it was about loss of control, about being captured and tortured, and he wondered if he had lost control of his mouth as well while the fever held. "What have you heard said about it around camp?" "Not much, only that you were dancing for the sun while under an armed guard. One niece said he was the one that helped you break free from the skewers." Crooked Eye snorted and pointed at his chest. "Some help." He knew he probably would have been expected to tear up his own chest anyway. He had been to several sun dances, even presiding over a few. Those who dance always tore themselves loose, but he still resented One Knee's flying tackle. He also knew that people were dying to hear him tell about the whole mess. They would watch him expectantly as he tread his way back and forth from Herb Woman's lodge each morning. A few times a day, someone would stop by his lodge with some gift, undoubtedly hoping to exchange a few words with him. He had told Snowbird to accept the gifts graciously and say that her husband was too ill to receive company, and gradually both visitors and gifts stopped coming. He knew he couldn't stay in his lodge forever, and he took the restlessness he felt as a sign that he was recovering. He stroked his woman's shoulder softly. "They took me because their leader was dying. They thought I could heal him." He watched Snowbird go stiff with attention. He knew she was as curious as everyone else, so he told her the story in emotional bursts. He watched her eyes the whole time, and he saw them become wet and shiny. "And just when I thought I would fall on my knees, I saw a way out." He spoke of Pale Moon and her relationship to White Hand. "It would have worked. I know it. If I could have gotten away from them my way, no one would have died, except maybe White Hand, who was going to die anyway. I am grateful that a rescue party was sent. I am. But 5 people died because they were sent, 2 of whom I cared about, and I will have to live knowing that 2 men gave themselves up for me." He stopped himself. He could feel his stomach tighten and an acid taste forming in the back of his mouth. There was no point in making himself feel bad. Snowbird put an arm around him carefully. "Those men knew the risks. They probably went partly because they wanted to help you, but I bet they went mostly for themselves, for their own personal gain." She put her head against the side of his. "Thank you for talking to me about it." He didn't tell her what lay beneath the surface of his thoughts. He didn't tell her that the rescue party was sent for the same reason that the renegades took him. They believed he had power. And 3 renegades and 2 of his own people were dead because of him, because of what he was, what he pretended to be. Somewhere deep within him, he knew that he had created the whole sorry episode, though later he would come to a more full understanding. Later he would see himself as a piece of wood drifting on an unstoppable tide. And he didn't tell his woman about what he had seen before One Knee's tackle. Behind One Knee and the others he had seen trails, not the visual distortion that would have made him see several One Knees, but trails full of different faces, all coming for him at once. He watched the snow fall and shuddered against the wind. His life dictated that he travel light, so he wore moccasins, leggings, and a shirt, nothing else. His face still hurt and stung, a good sign, but his ears no longer spoke to him. He still felt the overpowering survival force, though, the very force he had cursed so many times before. The unspoken gnawing that had forced him to do so many strange and wonderful things. His bones told him it would soon grow much colder, even before night fell. The iron-gray sky continued to spit clouds of snow that the wind turned into nettles. And since that wind would make it impossible to keep a fire going, and there was no time to build himself refuge, he would have to find a shelter. Or take one. He looked at the footprints that led into the mouth of the cave and made his decision. Heading away from the stone mouth toward a grove of pine trees, he told himself he had to do it, that he would freeze to death if he didn't. He pulled the Napaquan tomahawk from his belt and began to cut down a young tree that was about as big around as his leg. The soft wood was easy to cut, but it would be hard enough to suit his purpose. After felling it, he stripped it of its branches, cut off the narrow top, and sharpened both ends. He looked through the severed limbs until he found one that was dead. With the log hoisted onto his shoulder and the dry branch in one hand, he walked through the swirling whiteness. The wind actually staggered him once, and though his exertions had warmed him, he sensed that it had already gotten colder while he was working. The snow squall had picked up, as he knew it would. It took him a while to find a spot that suited him. When he found the little gully, he drove the fat end of the stake into the soft earth at its center with both hands. Reaching up and pulling the narrow end of the log to him, he pounded the wood deeper into the ground with the blunt end of his little axe. With each stroke, he steeled himself and emptied his mind of everything. After testing the stake by trying to shake it sideways, he took his knife and resharpened the end of it to a pale, tapering point. Now the wooden spike, set at a low mid-thigh angle, pointed the way back to the bear's cave like a giant's finger. From the tracks he knew it to be a real bear, not a small black one, but a great brown one, the kind that grew silvery white-tipped hair on its shoulder hump with its winter coat, the kind the unseen ones rode in, the way the Napaquan rode in their wooden cages, peering out of the beast's eyes the way white faces looked out the windows of those horse-drawn boxes. He hoped this beast was not too heavily burdened. It was going to be hard enough to kill without having it draw on the power of its unseen passengers. The weapons he had were useless against a real bear. He had heard stories of men who killed bears with knives and arrows, sometimes told by men wearing the teeth and claws of the very beasts, and he had no doubt that such a thing was possible. But he knew things like that only happened when the great forces were aligned in one's favor, and the simple fact was that one could only feel that the power was surging through them when they were already in a given situation. So far he felt nothing, not even fear. So he chose to try and outwit the great bear. Yes, he felt no fear. The fact that he was as good as dead if he didn't enrage the bear into killing itself, that he would freeze into human ice if he didn't steal the animal's cave, blocked out any fear. As he approached the cave holding the dead branch, he felt only the survival force, the empty gut, the biting cold, the surge older than time. He knew that if the bear was sleepy, his task would be even harder. The tracks were not good ones, but he had guessed them to be a couple of days old. As he walked into the mouth of the cave, he noticed that the snow had already covered those tracks completely. He stood still, breathed in the old air for a moment, and peered into nothingness. There was moisture in the cave, but he heard nothing but the howl of the wind outside. He took a couple of steps and a long breath through his nose. He smelled it, knew it to be there, somewhere in the blackness. The foul, sweet animal stink bit his nose, but it was the nose of a man, not a wolf, and told him only that he was not alone. He turned toward the outside world and looked at the snow blowing sideways. He knelt down and pulled the flint and iron from his side pouch. He held the calfskin bag upside down and let the punk fall on the ground in a pile. He gave the wood sparks, and soon it gave him back fire. He warmed his hands over the bright tongues and listened for movement behind him over its tender crackling. He listened out of old habit. He had learned that all the senses lie save one, the gut sense, and his gut sense told him that all was still behind him. The bear was probably asleep. The cave could also be a deep one, though he could not know whether it was or wasn't. He could not tell where the bear was just by smelling it. He was a man, not a wolf, and a man's senses could play games with him. The owner of the cave could be a bow shot away, or it could be sleeping a few paces from him. He cut the leather strap from his fire bag and threw the pouch next to his bow and quiver. If he didn't get back to the cave, He wouldn't need weapons, fire, or anything else. Taking the dry branch, he wrapped the twigs on the end of it in the old piece of leather. The flames caressed the branch and joined with it. He left the fire burning on the cave's floor and rose to his feet. He felt the power surging through him, but now his path was already laid, and the bear was already awake. He felt it like a change in the air that told of rain. He stood for a moment and drank it in, filling himself with this new knowledge, red in his guts like an animal's track. He sensed movement and knew it to be the great bear gaining its feet. He felt the animal studying his outline against the white death outside and looking at the torturously bright thing in his hand. He knew the bear smelled burning leather and wood, and he felt the animal's rage grow at his intrusion. With madness he felt these things, blurring with the beast and knowing it inside out. The madness rose in him like a whirlwind of dust on the plain. He strode forward. "This cave is mine. Today you will die, and I will pull the teeth from your head and drink your blood." Low rumbling was heard from the darkness as the man continued to step forward. The bear did not know how to act, being pressed upon by the man with the glowing arm. She had no similar experience to draw on, so she held her ground and filled the cave with bellowing. She was tense with power until circumstance freed her to act. The man's foot hit a stone and he fell. The dam burst. The bear saw the man fall to one knee and thundered silently toward him. He threw the torch at the terror he felt coming for him and rose to his feet, spinning. He ran toward the cave's mouth, stepping on his little fire and putting it out. He burst out into the wind and whiteness, the bear flying right behind him. He headed for the gully and its trap, even though he knew that now the bear was too close to him. He had planned to stand behind the stake as bait so the animal would impale itself. But now, as he hit the gully, he ran past the sharp wood. He passed close to it, hoping the snow kept the bear from seeing it, hoping it would feel the spike instead. The bear never saw the stake, but she ran right past it just the same. The man was sure he was dead when he heard nothing but heavy footfalls and awful roaring behind him. He felt it in his gut. No man can outrun a bear over any kind of distance. His guts told him he would be tackled from behind and torn apart. He reached down and pulled his knife from its sheath, thinking he would wound the bear as it killed him. He would let the bear know it had killed a predator, not a deer or an elk. The ground disappeared before him, the chasm catching him by surprise because the snow dimmed his eyes. He made an instantaneous body decision, turning on his right foot and leaping to his left. He hit stomach first and began to slide over the cliff's edge, speeded along by the fallen snow. He stabbed the earth with the big knife he carried, and his momentum swung his legs around so that they thrust out into open space. This time the bear saw the danger, but there was nothing she could do about it. She ran on 4 legs, not 2. There would be no sideways leap for her. She had instinctively angled herself toward the sudden shift of her prey, but now she dropped her rear in the snow and tried to dig in with all 4 feet. Her weight carried her over the edge, bawling. The man held on to the knife's handle and breathed raggedly. He saw the bear slide past him like a shadow and heard it hit the bottom of the gorge. He heard it somewhere below him, mewling and blubbering out horrible pain. The fall had not killed it. He pulled himself up and swung his legs back onto solid ground. He laid on that ground, gasping, his ears full of the somehow heart-rending cries of the beast that would have torn him apart piecemeal if it had caught him. He rose to his feet and looked over the edge. He thought he saw something dark moving in the whiteness, but the storm blocked his eyes. He pulled his knife from the ground, noting how he had driven it between many rocks. There was a cut in the earth, as his weight had pulled on the knife until the blade found solid rock. The man smoothed the cut over with his hand and stood. He headed for the cave, and as he walked, he felt deep emptiness. He had felt the power, but it was just good fortune that had saved him. His blade had found a spare patch of earth in a field of stones. He felt sadness instead of triumph as he entered the cave. He knew he had to see to its former resident. He picked up the fire bag and bow and quiver. He knew he had to finish the bear, snowstorm or no snowstorm. Walking back into the cold, he thought about how he had been so sure he was going to die, how he had felt it in his gut. Maybe he had joined too closely with the bear, and it was the bear that felt death coming, and not he. Or maybe a person's gut could lie to him, the way his eyes and ears often did. Either way, the unseen ones would have to find new lodgings.